Ambrosio Rodriguez is a criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor. He also led a sexual assault and child abuse unit at a district attorney's office here in Southern California. Ambrosio, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
From a prosecution point of view, how difficult is it to go back, in some cases 20, maybe 30 years, to gather the evidence to make a case of past child sexual abuse?
In cases that are 20, 30 years old, the most important thing is to find other victims. That is, if you only have one victim or one alleged victim coming forward, it's going to be extremely difficult. But if you can find now adults that over the years were molested by the same person in the same type of pattern, when you're dealing with, you know, a coach, a teacher, someone in a position of trust, it becomes easier and easier. Jurors can kind of see how that pattern was established by the person. It just rings true, given everything we know now about how child molesters operate.
This case is still early. More than 20 people have come forward. Would you expect more?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's not rare in a situation where you're dealing with a serial child molester. I mean, we saw that at Penn State. We've seen that with Bill Cosby. There have been other cases in the media where you see someone in a position of power and authority that just becomes a serial child molester, already is, but has that protection from his position. I mean, we saw that with the priests in the Catholic Church scandal.
Is there a familiar pattern in how these sex scandals unfold in institutions like Sandusky at Penn State, Jimmy Savile at the BBC?
Yeah, first of all, you have a person who's in a position of power and authority that becomes a gatekeeper to these children's future. And so they're able to really pick their victims, right? A lot of these victims have similar kind of demographics. That is, they have issues at home, maybe there's issues of poverty, and they kind of rely on this person for acceptance, for love, for guidance. And they can be their children, so they're easy to manipulate, victimize, and this kind of awful things happens over and over again.
In cases like Sandusky and Savile, how do those in charge, how do they rationalize covering up these crimes? Because in both those cases, a lot of people knew what was going on, and nobody said anything for a very, very long time.
I think there's willful blindness. There has to be, because something happens within, I guess, human nature, that it becomes more important to protect the institution. And it's an institution of power and status and a lot of money, billions of dollars. And that becomes easier and more important to protect than children. We shouldn't be surprised. That is kind of the tragedy of human nature, is that we do that all the time.
Yeah. Okay. We'll have a lot more on this next hour, so we're lucky you'll be sticking around. So we'll catch up next hour. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, it's still to come. I'm joined once again by criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Ambrosio Rodriguez, as well as therapist Dr. Paul Hokemeyer, a specialist in child trauma. Thank you both for being with us. Ambrosio, first to you, we've had more than 20 former footballers who have come forward over the past couple of days making very similar allegations. This seems to be just at the very beginning of this scandal. Would you expect more people to be coming forward?
Oh, absolutely. In cases like this, what happens over time, as people have been courageous enough to come forward, it gives other victims the courage to tell their story as well. We've seen that over and over in very well-publicized cases like Penn State or Bill Cosby, and you have that happening here again.
And Paul, these are grown men. Still, how difficult is it for someone to come forward, make these kind of allegations? I guess especially in the early stages of something like this. What are they going through right now?
What they're going through is a re-traumatization. So what they're doing is extraordinarily difficult. When you think about initially what happened to them, they put their trust and their faith into someone who was supposed to protect them, who was supposed to lead them, who was supposed to be a guiding light in their lives. This person betrayed them in a very severe way. So now going back and bringing all of this up is re-traumatizing for them and is extraordinarily difficult and painful.
Are they reliving everything that they sort of had tried to forget in their youth right now?
Well, they certainly brings it up. And so what happens when somebody experiences sexual abuse, they're traumatized and they experience PTSD. So anytime something similar happens, anytime that comes into their awareness or consciousness, their body has a physical reaction to it, and it puts them into a stress mode. So it's very difficult for them socially, it's very difficult for them emotionally, and it's very painful for them physically.
Ambrosio, as a prosecutor trying to gather evidence dealing with a victim of this kind of crime, first of all, how difficult is it actually to build a case, and how conscious do you have to be of what the victim's already been through?
Well, let me just talk about what evidence is and isn't in cases like this.
Yeah.
A lot of people think of evidence as what they see on TV, DNA, fingerprints, kind of biological evidence. You're not going to have that type of evidence in cases like this. What you have are victims coming forward and telling their story. In that pattern of one victim after the other, telling similar stories, that's what the evidence is. And the jury relies on the words that come out of these men's mouth in order to make the determination as to whether or not there's enough evidence to convict them. These types of cases are difficult to put together simply because what these men have to kind of go through in order to prepare them for trial. But they're almost always successful just because of the volume of victims that come forward. Look, I've had cases like this as a prosecutor where you have someone in their 30s or 40s talking about something that happened to them as children, as little girls. And they are stoic in their voices, but their face changes. I've seen the tears. It's heartbreaking. And you don't need DNA evidence or anything like that. You have their words, and it's very powerful.
You can see how real it all is. Right now, the head of the FA in England is saying he doesn't know if there was a cover-up, but there was a cover-up in cases like Penn State. There was a cover-up for Jimmy Savile with the BBC. There was a cover-up in the Catholic Church. How do people in positions of authority actually rationalize covering up these kinds of crimes?
You have to take a look at the way that we're built psychologically. And so when we have a piece of information that threatens us, that makes us feel unsafe, that challenges our world, we get what's called defend it. So we deny it, we rationalize it, we pretend that it doesn't exist. And so there's an extraordinary amount of that going on in these particular cases. And there's particularly men-on-men sex, there's still an extraordinary amount of shame and stigma attached to it. So not only do you have the abuse, but now you have the extra cultural layer of it being men-on-men sex, which is still quite shameful.
Ambrosio, for those who do cover up these crimes, just in general sense, I guess in the United States, from your point of view, are the penalties stiff enough? Are they enough of a deterrent?
Well, in California, they're very stiff. I mean, most sex crimes in California involving children either involve multiple years in prison, in state prison, or life sentences. So California and most of the United States have very, very stiff sentences, with the idea that, this started happening back in the 80s and through the 90s. The idea is once you commit this, you are taken out of the general population. And even if you eventually do get out of prison, you have to register as a sex offender for the rest of your life. So, and these are they're called strike offenses. If you get enough of them, it's, again, life in prison.
So is there rehabilitation for the offenders, and is there rehabilitation for those who have been abused?
Absolutely. There's rehabilitation. Let's first start with the ones who have been abused. Yeah. These are the people who have the extraordinary courage first to come forward and say that this happened to them, and then they need to put themselves into the care of someone who they trust and who can handle their extraordinary vulnerability. It takes time. It takes a lot of hard work, but there is extraordinary recovery that does happen. In terms of the perpetrators, there is recovery that does happen there too. It's different in the sense of that it needs to be monitored very closely, it needs to be very rigid, and it needs to have a very long tail on it, a long term to it.
Okay, and of course we're just at the beginning of another scandal involving children and sexual abuse. This one, of course, happening in the UK. Ambrosio and Doctor, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Paul,
Thank you.
We'll take a short break when we come back next here on Newsroom LA. US and Norwegian